Feeding an ancient army was one of the greatest organisational challenges of the pre-modern world. A single Roman legion, over 5,000 men, consumed roughly a ton of grain every single day. Multiply that across a campaign force of several legions, and the task becomes truly staggering. This is the story of how Rome kept its soldiers alive on the march. At the end of each day's march, legionaries built a fortified camp from scratch. Trenches were dug, ramparts raised, and sharpened stakes driven into the earth, all before a tent went up. Inside, the camp followed a rigid grid, the same layout repeated every time regardless of terrain. This standardization meant every soldier knew exactly where to go, even arriving in total darkness. Within that grid, the central supply area held the army's most critical resource, grain. Quartermasters tallied every sack against detailed wax tablet records. Nothing was distributed without first being counted. Each soldier received a fixed daily ration of wheat, carefully measured out by bronze scoop. This system ensured fairness and prevented dangerous waste across thousands of hungry men. But receiving raw grain was only the beginning. Roman soldiers were expected to process their own food. Each 8-man tent group carried a hand mill, 2 heavy circular stones that ground wheat into coarse flour. From this flour, soldiers mixed simple dough and baked flat bread called bucellatum directly on heated stones beside their cooking fires. The standard military diet was plain but carefully functional. Alongside bread, soldiers drank posca, a sharp mixture of vinegar and water that was cheap to produce and naturally resistant to spoiling. Dried meat, hard cheese and salt supplemented the grain ration. The most common hot meal was pulse, a thick wheat porridge cooked in bronze pots, sometimes enriched with whatever oil or animal fat was available. Each soldier carried his own rations in a leather satchel, enough grain, salt, and dried meat for several days. This personal supply meant the army could survive brief separations from its wagon train, but those individual stores ran out quickly, and constant resupply was an ever-present operational concern for every Roman commander in the field. The real lifeline of a Roman army on campaign was its wagon train. Heavy 4-wheeled carts hauled the bulk of the grain, oil, vinegar, and equipment that no soldier could carry himself. Each wagon was drawn by oxen, slow but powerful animals capable of pulling enormous loads across rough provincial roads. Alongside them, mule trains carried supplies into steeper terrain where wheeled vehicles simply could not go. Maintaining these vehicles was a critical daily task. Drivers inspected axles, greased hubs, and checked iron tyre bands before every departure. A single broken wheel could block an entire column on a narrow forest road, forcing delays that rippled backward through the full marching order. Replacement parts were carried within the train itself, and repair crews worked quickly to keep everything moving. River crossings presented another serious hazard. Fords had to be carefully scouted in advance, and wagons crossed one at a time to avoid piling up in the current. At midday halts, loads were resecured, animals watered, and anything loosened during the morning's travel was repaired on the spot. For longer distances, the Romans moved supplies by water whenever possible. Grain ships carried enormous quantities across the Mediterranean to military ports, where cargo was transferred to flat-bottomed river barges. These shallow vessels were poled upstream along rivers deep into frontier territory, reaching inland depots where the supplies were finally loaded onto waiting carts for the last overland stretch to the army. River barges were a vital link in this supply chain. Flat-bottomed and shallow-drafted, they could navigate inland waterways that sea-going ships never could. Crews of labourers poled them upstream against the current, delivering grain and oil to small riverside depots scattered along frontier routes. At each depot, the cargo was carefully counted, recorded, and transferred onto ox carts for the final journey inland to the waiting army. But waterways only reached so far. Armies campaigning deep in foreign territory had to source food locally. Roman commanders routinely sent detachments into nearby farming villages to requisition grain directly from the harvest. This was not random looting. It followed a structured process. Officers negotiated quantities with local farmers, and written records were kept of what was taken. though for the villagers it was rarely a welcome exchange. Foraging parties fanned out across the surrounding countryside to gather what the wagons and barges could not provide. Soldiers collected firewood from nearby forests, cut timber for essential repairs, and rounded up livestock from open pastures to drive back to camp. These operations required armed escorts, since scattered foraging groups far from the main force were dangerously vulnerable to ambush. Near the camp, field bakeries operated at a larger scale than individual tent groups could manage. Stone ovens built from local materials produced bread in bulk, supplementing the small flatbreads soldiers baked at their own fires. Camp followers, the merchants, craftspeople, and families who trailed every Roman army also contributed, selling vegetables, cheese, dried lentils and herbs at informal markets along the camp perimeter. All of these varied supply streams converged daily on the central storage area within the camp. This was the most heavily guarded section of the entire encampment. Grain was the most critical supply, but it was far from the only one. Amphorae of olive oil, soured wine and garum, a pungent fermented fish sauce prized across the Roman world, was stored alongside the grain in carefully organised rows. Quartermasters tracked every single vessel, recording what arrived, what was distributed, and what remained. Losing count of supplies in the field could prove as dangerous as losing a pitched battle. Every legionary was also responsible for carrying his own personal equipment on the march. The standard marching load was enormous. A soldier bore his armour, shield, javelins, cooking gear, digging tools, rations, a hand mill, a water flask and a heavy woolen cloak, all suspended from a wooden carrying pole balanced over one shoulder. Roman writers called the soldiers who bore these crushing loads Marius's mules, a reference to the famous general who first imposed this demanding burden on the infantry. When equipment broke down, it had to be repaired immediately in the field. Armourers travelling with the legion mended damaged mail shirts ring by ring, using pliers and loose iron links. Leather workers restitched torn sandals and replaced worn or missing hobnails. Spare javelin shafts and sword fittings were kept in organised reserve near officers' tents. An army that could not maintain its own gear in working condition would quickly lose its effective ability to fight. Each night the camp was built, and each morning it was torn down again. Tents were folded, stakes bundled, wagons reloaded, and animals reyoked, all before the trumpet sounded the march. The speed of this daily routine was itself a remarkable logistical achievement. A well-drilled legion could dismantle an entire fortified camp and resume marching within just a few hours of waking, eating dried bread and drinking posca on the move to avoid any unnecessary delay. When supply lines broke, the consequences were severe and swift. Armies that outran their logistics or marched into territory, deliberately stripped bare by the enemy, faced a crisis no amount of training or discipline could overcome. Grain stores emptied, pack animals collapsed from exhaustion, and were butchered on the roadside for whatever they could provide. Soldiers resorted to scraping bark from trees, digging roots from hard ground, and drinking from muddy near-dry creek beds that offered little more than clouded, silted water. Wagons that broke down were simply abandoned in place. There was no time or energy to repair them, and no surviving animals left to pull them. The orderly column that had once stretched impressively across an entire valley began to fragment. Gaps opened between units. Stragglers fell behind. The carefully maintained formation dissolved into scattered, weakened groups struggling to stay together on an open road with no shelter and no resupply anywhere in sight. History offers no shortage of examples. Roman campaigns in hostile territory sometimes ended in catastrophe when supply chains failed. Commanders who pushed too far beyond their depots or who badly underestimated the distances involved watched their armies starve before any battle was fought. Logistics was never glamorous, but its failure could destroy a fighting force more completely than any enemy army ever could. Relief came only when the army reached a prepared supply depot. Behind fortified walls, stacked grain and flowing water waited. Fresh bread was distributed, water skins refilled, and damaged equipment finally replaced. The depot system, a network of fortified supply stations positioned along major routes, was what made sustained Roman campaigning across vast distances possible. Without it, even the most powerful army in the ancient world could not survive long in the field.